Good evening, everyone. Before we begin, I have a couple of quick announcements. This event is being recorded and will be available on Comcast Xfinity, video on demand. Digital TV subscribers to Comcast will be able to see this event on television for no additional cost. If you are sharing a comment or question tonight, we ask that you speak directly into the microphone, and the microphones are there and there. It says point to the standing microphones. So that we can all hear you in the theater and on the video. Please understand that by speaking, you are giving the Ford Hall Forum and Comcast permission to record you. Welcome to the Ford Hall Forum at Suffolk University, and thank you for joining us to present the 2013 First Amendment Award to the aptly named Congressman Barney Frank. This special evening is made possible through the support of our event sponsors, including Prince Lobel Tie, WWII, Plymouth Rock Assurance, and Compass 8. We thank you for your generosity. The Forum also appreciates the steadfast support of our partner, Suffolk University, which provides us with essential resources, including the use of this Walsh Theater. With the help of our sponsors and our members, the Forum continues to present enthralling discussions on the issues of the day, free of cost to the public. As you listen, learn, and engage in tonight's forum, I hope you will be inspired to ensure that this opportunity of expression remains available to all of us. Please keep the Ford Hall Forum running by becoming a member. Be sure to take a membership envelope from the information table at the lobby. Let me tell you a little bit about the First Amendment Award. The Ford Hall Forum at Suffolk University is about the freedom of expression, based largely, as you know, on the First Amendment. It discusses controversial points of view and promoting a culture of involvement in a nonpartisan environment, from Ayn Rand to Gloria Steinem, from Rosa Parks to Malcolm X, from Eleanor Roosevelt to Henry Kissinger. Ford Hall Forum speakers have pushed you beyond your comfort zone, compelling you to speak out and question what you thought you knew. At 105 years old, the Forum has now been handed down through several generations, playing a significant role in Boston's intellectual tradition. When we talk about Boston's reputation as a strong, smart, and birthplace of revolution, we are talking about the Ford Hall Forum. We celebrate this legacy of an engaged citizenry and civilized debate by bestowing the First Amendment Award upon someone who has demonstrated extraordinary commitment to promoting and facilitating our freedom of expression. The Ford Hall Forum owes much of its longevity to its loyal membership and the dedication of a series of remarkable longtime volunteers. Tonight, we remember two such volunteers through this award, Lewis and Evelyn Smith, who epitomize the values of the organization. Lou supported many Boston institutions, but the organization he felt closest to was this, the Ford Hall Forum. He first joined the Forum as a junior usher back in 1910. He loved being exposed to different ideas and felt that people could develop respect for each other by sharing different points of view. He also believed that by attending Ford Hall Forum lectures, he received an education. Lou eventually took over as director and treasurer in 1952 and would remain in that position for 23 years. In the late 1960s, Lou married Evelyn, the widow of a lifelong friend, She shared his beliefs, and together they nurtured a love of freedom of speech in their children, nieces, nephews, and grandchildren. Nowhere was this more apparent than at the dinner table, often the scene of long and loud debates. Unfortunately, Lou fell victim to Parkinson's disease. Those who knew him believed that his life was prolonged by the Watergate hearings, that he hung around to hear the outcome. Evelyn continued to serve on this board until her death in 1993. An elegant woman with striking white hair, a unique, gravelly voice, and strong views, she continued the tradition of holding lively dinner parties, attracting folks from all walks of life and all points of the political spectrum. Evelyn may not have agreed with her guests' opinion, but she always treated them with respect. In the spirit of Lewis and Evelyn Smith, we offered the First Amendment Award to Barney Frank, who, by having the courage to speak out on behalf of those he represents, gives life and meaning to the First Amendment. And lastly, a little bit about Barney. He represented the Massachusetts 4th Congressional District in the U.S. House of Representatives from 1981 to the beginning of this year. After graduating from Harvard College and Harvard Law School, Frank worked as a political aide before serving in the Massachusetts House of Representatives from 1972 to 1980. In his work as congressman, Barney Frank consistently chose to be the voice of those who often had no voice: combat zone workers, the elderly, Japanese Americans in World War II, and even animals. Barney Frank is known for his commitment to civil rights and democracy, receiving perfect ratings from such organizations as the NAACP and the Human Rights Campaign. In 1987, he became the first member of Congress to voluntarily come out as gay. Just last year, he became the first U.S. representative to marry someone of the same sex when he wedded his longtime partner, James Reddy. Frank often taught and published on public affairs, promoting each American's right and responsibility to govern ourselves. He has graced the Ford Hall Forum stage 7 times, from the spring of 1979 to just last May. One of the most powerful statements he made on the defense of civil liberties was his opposition to the Respect for Americans Fallen Heroes Act, proving that his support for the First Amendment supersedes any personal agenda. In January of this year, he completed his 32-year tenure as a United States Congressman, throughout which he has been nothing less than boldly outspoken at every opportunity. Here now, we are fortunate to have, is the mayor of Newton, Seti Warren, who will present the First Amendment Award to Representative Barney Frank.
Hi, good evening, everyone. It is a distinct pleasure to be here with my friend, Congressman Barney Frank. Before I say a few words about my friend, I want to acknowledge Jim Ritty, who's here. It's great to see you, Jim. And it is an honor to be on the same stage with the Peter Mead. Peter, I think all of us admire your devotion to public service, what you've done for the city and community. So it's wonderful to be with you. Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to be somewhat brief here, I think. I got elected to become Newton's mayor in 2009. And as a young politician starting out, learning what it is to lead in a very complex environment, you turn to people that have made a difference. People that can take compassion, can take vision and beliefs and turn them into action. And I didn't have to go far. One of my constituents, right down the road, Congressman Barney Frank, has been leading this country, speaking for those who don't have a voice, ensuring that every single person from every single background, from every single walk of life, has the opportunity to succeed. From people who historically, African Americans have not had an opportunity for education and housing. Barney Frank was not only there, but he made sure legislation was passed in the United States Congress to provide opportunity. To people who just wanted to make sure they could not only get married, but ensure that they had the same benefits as people who were not gay had. I really believe that Barney Frank, in his efforts over the past 32 years, have set the gold standard for those in public life. Right now in our country, we're debating so many different issues, and we face very complex issues. Issues of national security, issues of the economy, getting people back to work, ensuring that that ladder of opportunity still exists for all people. And that clarity that Barney has offered through his work, whether it's Dodd-Frank or whether, as I said, we ensure that people of all backgrounds are able to enjoy every benefit that this country has to offer. Barney Frank continues to be a voice and set the standard. As a young mayor who came into office in a complex time, I was able to turn to him not only as a colleague, but really as a mentor, to understand what this is really about. What it's really about is making sure you make a difference for every person out there in this country and beyond. So I am honored to be here to present this award this evening. We heard a little bit about Lois and Evelyn Smith, and in the spirit of them, the Ford Hall Forum at Suffolk University presents the 2013 First Amendment Award to Representative Barney Frank. Thank you so much for your leadership.
Well, now this is the moment you've all been waiting for, the conversation between Peter Mead and Barney. Peter Mead, as most of you know, was appointed Chief Economic Development Officer for the City of Boston by Mayor Menino in April of 2011. He serves on the mayor's cabinet and leads the Boston Redevelopment Authority, which has been setting Boston's planning and economic development agenda for the past 50 years. And he launched his career in the 1970s as a member of the administration of Mayor Kevin White, when we were all a part of that.
60.
Was it?
Yeah.
Okay, I stand corrected. He served there, the city of Boston, through many roles, and he became the president and CEO of the Edward Kennedy Institute for the United States Senate, dedicated to inspiring the next generation of citizens and leaders to engage in the public square. Mead was an executive vice president of Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts over a decade, and he took over as president and CEO of the New England Council. Notably, he took the Ford Hall Forum stage just 1 year ago as the moderator of our Beantown Centennials Forum. He's also known in the city of Boston, at the risk of embarrassing him as one of the most likable people in city government. It really is. And so I am thrilled to introduce the two of you and to let you have a go at talking about this great city of ours and Barney's great career.
Thank you. Thanks very much for your kind introduction. You know, the funny thing is I worked in the White administration. Barney recruited me. And not mentioned in the bio, for several years I was a talk show host at WWII, and Barney would be a guest. But Barney was a talk show host in WWII before I was, and I was a guest on Barney's show. We do go back a long way, and you need to discipline us not to get into old political stories of things going back several years. Let me begin, before we get specifically to the First Amendment, to mushiness about constitutional amendments. This week we've heard a lot about Miranda warning, Fifth Amendment, and it seems to me that a lot of people in this country today can get mushy very easily on the Fifth and the First Amendment, and at the same time, the Second Amendment is supposed to be a thing of steel and of cement. I presume most of us who are here tonight are supporters of the First Amendment. Do we need to do a better job of politicking in this country?
I think not so much on the First Amendment as on the criminal procedures. And by the way, they are vastly exaggerated. I spent a lot of time, as you've done, Peter, being in government, talking to law enforcement people. I have run into very few law enforcement people who believe that the Miranda, telling people what their rights are, that procedure substantially retards in any way the law enforcement. I don't believe it does. And as an example, the notion that Yakar Chanayev might be found innocent by a jury or that a judge might exclude evidence is bizarre. It doesn't make any difference what he says. I mean, the Miranda issue was very much of a sideshow there in terms of, at least to the extent that people said, oh, this is going to get him off. I think, I must say, I was particularly disappointed with some members of the Senate who, it seemed to me they were, it's Pirandello's 6 characters in search of an author. We saw 6 senators in search of an issue. There was no problem here. The one was killed, one was caught. He's going to be dispatched through the justice system, and there was just this need to complain. On the other hand, I do think the First Amendment is actually in pretty good shape, and I've been thinking about this. The problem with the First Amendment, it tends to come under threat when people see an external threat. And you go back to World War I and the Red Scares with our great Democratic President Woodrow Wilson, who was awful on the subject, with A. Mitchell Palmer. And then we have another great liberal president, Franklin Roosevelt, locking up the Japanese Americans. Then we have the McCarthyite outrages during and after the Korean War. And there were controversies about Vietnam. What's encouraging to me is that there have been problems with profiling, there have been problems with group guilt being imputed. But free speech, I think, has survived 2001 very well. There were not very many cases of inappropriate prosecutions. The criminal justice system needs to be defended, and it is an embarrassment that there are people being held indefinitely. More than an embarrassment, it's a shame that people are being held indefinitely in Guantanamo. So I would divide that question. The First Amendment, I think, is in pretty good shape, and I think we can say we came through this. There were people trying to use it, but on the whole, I think it came through pretty well.
Take me back to college. At Harvard University, you became involved in a controversy about First Amendment rights and what students could do and what should be published that belonged to professors. How hot an issue was it at the time, and how did you get to your position at that young age?
What I remember is actually that was a Fourth Amendment issue. There was at a halftime show, one Harvard undergraduate, I was actually a graduate student at the time, appeared on the field during halftime wearing the robes of some high-ranking Episcopal cleric. And that was, this is the 60s. People were more easily shocked in some ways. And that led to a outrage on the part of who? I don't know, maybe the Episcopalians, although they they are a people noticeably slow to outrage, as we know. And one of the deans, there was a suspicion that it was a particular student, and one of the deans entered his room and found the robe, and it was, I thought that there ought to be some privacy in the students' rooms.
But there was a time at Harvard, I thought, when somebody had published in the paper, I think, or someplace, what a professor had said at a lecture, and there were people at Harvard who were saying, no, the student didn't have a right to publish that because the professor hadn't given his permission.
I don't remember that specifically. I think the notion that, let's be very clear, it wasn't a copyright issue. I'm a believer in copyright. I have to say I differ with some people who invoke the First Amendment to be able to take other people's very hard work and ignore that. I say that because I am right now ensconced in the building Jim and I have in Maine, trying to write a book, and it's not fun, and I feel very possessive about it, and I'm very disinclined to share it willy-nilly with people who haven't done a lick of work about it. But yeah, I thought that was a great mistake. I mean, I don't know why an academic would be worried about. No, you know, if it were distorted, it would be a different story. But I'll be honest, I don't remember that one as fully.
Now, for you, has the First Amendment always been an easy place for you to be to defend the First Amendment? Is it because you saw danger? You remember the?
No, it's just instinctive. I guess, you know, look, I like to talk. I found myself early on being criticized for things I said that I thought people had a right to say. And you know, you can think of sort of rationales, but it's been instinctive. I have always been a great believer in people being able to say what they want, and I have to say too, and I've always thought that the dangers were exaggerated, but yeah, I've been a very strong free speech advocate and free press for as long as I can remember.
So, if you look at the time, sort of the roller coaster you were talking about before, when the First Amendment comes under attack, and it's funny, you mentioned President Wilson, President Roosevelt. It's interesting that Earl Warren was helping to lock up the Japanese in California.
Right, and the leading opponent of it was J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover resisted that when Earl Warren was the Attorney General of California and was egging President Roosevelt on.
Now, do you worry about us getting into a place on the roller coaster ride where that comes back?
I'm feeling pretty good that it won't. But let me tell you, actually, going back to Harvard, and I'm thinking about this, I was concerned about threats to free speech when I was at Harvard, and it's one of the things I think those of us on the left who defend free speech should be better at. Threats to free speech can come from two sources. They can come from government prosecution, and they can come from mobs. The mobs can include not necessarily violent mobs, but mobs of students shouting people down. And during the period when I was at Harvard, free speech was far more in danger, frankly, from the radical element of students than it was from the administration. And I think that's something we need to be very clear about. And I've seen, and I think it's a problem in academia now. You know, one of the worst Supreme Court decisions on the question of the First Amendment, I think it was Feiner against New York, but I got about a dozen judges in here, correct me if I miscite, thank you, Rudy, but that was the one where the cops gave what became known as the heckler's veto, where a guy was speaking, and he was speaking in very anti-American terms in the late 40s, and somebody said to the cop, if you don't shut that guy up, I'm going to punch him in the mouth. And the cop, afraid of trouble, told the guy to stop speaking, and the guy said, oh, you got a right to speak. And they arrested him for disturbing the peace, but the way in which he was disturbing the peace was other people were planning to violently interfere with his rights. And the Supreme Court actually upheld that, as I believe, 5-4, one of their worst decisions. I don't think that doesn't hold anymore. But you have that in some universities. There was a deference to the right to shout people down. So I did think during that period, freedom of speech and freedom of expression came more from non-government actors on the left than it did from of course, within the university, than it did from the government. And I do think, I feel we're pretty secure about the First Amendment. It's interesting, by the way, that the Supreme Court has held it up pretty well. And the test is this. Look, we had the Supreme Court decision about flag burning. We've had a number of Supreme Court decisions overturning things that we did on constitutional grounds. One was the Fallen Heroes Act. That's the one that said if that vicious nut from Kansas, Phelps, he used to go to funerals and say, of American soldiers who had been killed in the war, he'd say, God's punishing America for fags. And the law then said, obviously a funeral shouldn't be disrupted on the grounds, but the law said, as I recall, that you couldn't stand within a mile of the place for 2 hours before the funeral. The three of us voted against it. Ron Paul, me, and I think Dave Wu from Oregon. And the Supreme Court threw that out. And the response in Congress was, okay, what can get by the court? So they made it better. The Supreme Court threw out a law we passed about crush videos, videos of people stamping on small animals. And the Supreme Court threw that one out. And the response of Congress has been okay. I mean, when the Supreme Court threw out the flag burning law, the Supreme Court was vindicated by Congress. So I am pretty secure now about it. Part of it is, it's interesting, you now have a lot of people on the right politically who believe that the big bad government's coming after them. So they have become somewhat defenders of free speech. And of course, one of the almost absolutists on free speech, you know, the old stop clock that's right twice a day. Well, the First Amendment is Antonin Scalia's stop clock. It's the only time he's right. But he's a very strong First Amendment defender. So I really do believe that that's fairly well entrenched right now. As a matter of fact, the problem we have with the First Amendment now is that Scalia and the other conservative justices have caricatured it by saying that free speech means that you may have no regulation whatsoever of money in elections. And there was this argument that it is not a democracy unless you have unlimited anonymous spending on elections, which should make in America feel very proud, because it would mean that we would be the only democracy ever in the history of the world, because other countries that we think of as democratic have, of course, much more severe restrictions.
Well, it was an interesting bit of jiu-jitsu to have corporations become people in that. To that First Amendment.
Yeah, actually it made me feel very empowered, because I had always thought, when I was going to law school, was that corporations were the creatures of the state. And then I read that corporations were endowed by their creators with inalienable rights. So I apparently, as a member of the legislature of Congress,
have created.
I endowed some people with inalienable rights. Didn't know I was doing it.
Now, when you look at that, and frankly, the danger is a significant one in terms of anonymous donations through the political process. A prejudice, if we were doing the right thing, would pay for campaigns publicly. But that gets shot down all the time. In between now and maybe someday we get to that, is there a chance of any reversal? Is there a chance of a law the Supreme Court might allow in these days?
The current court, no. But there were 5 justices on one side and 4 on the other. It's interesting, by the way. I had a letter published in the book review of the New York Times Sunday about Sandra Day O'Connor. In a review of a book she put together, Adam Liptak quoted her as saying that she was very disappointed that after she retired, a lot of what she voted for was being undone. Affirmative action, abortion for 2. But then she said, particularly with regard to that terrible Citizens United decision, which allowed all this massive anonymous political spending, gee, I'm away for a few years and look what happened. And I wrote a letter saying, well, it's interesting that she says that, because she brought it on. She deliberately timed her resignation until George W. Bush won. She said at the time, oh good, first of all, she voted for him. She gave one of the critical 5 votes, but she resigned so that Bush could replace her. If she'd resigned under Clinton, she wouldn't have been overturned. But that's the answer. You know, look, let's do the demographics. If Barack Obama's successor is a Democrat, then that decision is very likely to be overturned, because you get one of the 5 to retire or be ill or die, and that will happen. I mean, no one thinks that's settled law. that race has not been judicated and isn't going to be. And I think that's a very strong feeling. And by the way, it's interesting now, there may be some support for it, because there are two major, two names come to mind as people who are doing this for their political purposes: Karl Rove and Mike Bloomberg. Bloomberg has twice now defeated people who would appear to have been winners in Democratic primaries by pumping in millions of dollars. He doesn't do it anonymously, and so that differentiates him from some of the others. So I think some of the people in Congress on the more conservative side, if that spreads, and that, by the way, is the argument I find a very silly argument from some of my liberal friends who say, oh, well, you know, Obama's raising money now that same way with corporate money, you shouldn't do it. Unilateral disarmament is a very stupid idea. And it is not just that you need to defend yourself, but the only way you're going to get that removed politically, I think, we do it through the court, but you could get it removed politically if enough members of Congress across the spectrum say, oh, geez, I can't have this. And, but I will go back and say, I cannot imagine a Democratic president who gets a chance to replace Justice Kennedy, Justice Scalia, or any of the other five, not making sure that that they are going to overturn Citizens United.
Now, let me go to libraries and children. Let's say we're talking about kids in elementary school. What is it? What should the rules be in terms of parental permission or deciding what's in those libraries that the children have access to?
With regard to libraries, I don't think the parents should be running the libraries, and I would trust the judgment of the librarians. I do have to say, when I read these cases that I've seen where people have objected to terrible things in the library, I can't imagine that the kids didn't already know everything that was there. I mean, you know, I sometimes think, particularly when you say elementary school, it's a little different, but when I listen to what some of my colleagues say about sex and pornography, that some of them were never 13. They were like born 32. No recollection of what 13-year-olds were thinking about, were interested in, were going to find out. And I do think, I would say this about libraries. I think it's fair to hold libraries to not the most controversial stuff. I think, you know, there is some room for people to make their own choices. So, and that includes, you know, stuff on the left, stuff on the right. You know, we have to say it goes both ways. We don't want vicious racist stuff, but I think anything that you have to make a judgment if someone is, if you're talking about 7-year-olds and 8-year-olds, I think you can hold some of that to a common denominator in libraries. There is one library issue, by the way, when I should go back where I was maybe a little too sanguine. One of the things in the legislation that I voted against are these letters that the FBI can send to libraries and others demanding that they turn over information about an individual and prohibiting them from telling the individual that he or she is targeted. And a very brave mayor of Newton and librarian in Newton defied one of those. Said his predecessor, David Cohn, said no, they weren't going to do that. And I was very, very pleased to have that happen, that kind of intimidation of what people are reading without any kind of warrant, without anything. That was, I think that's been diminished. And it was the worst of it. But as far as the young kids, I think, and now as far as the parents are concerned, no, I don't think any parent has the right to censor the library. I mean, your parents should be in charge of their own children, and I don't think they obviously have certain rights about their own children. They should not impose those on other children. So I would not have any parental censorship of a library.
What? In all these cases, let's go back to the case in Newton. Wouldn't it be, shouldn't it be a case that you've got to go before a judge if you want to find something? And again, just like we were talking about the Miranda warning, how complicated is that, and how often do judges actually turn these people down? You know,
not at all. And remember, again, what we're talking about, we're trying to find out, what do people read? Well,
not enough.
It's very hard to think that that would be a legitimate prejudicial, a legitimate element in a complaint. I mean, it's hard to think that, I hope there's no crime in what you read, certainly not if it was in a library. And I do think that the negative effect of those is greatly exaggerated. I would ask them, show me a prosecution where you were able to do that. Look, that's one of the things that troubles me now, is and we don't know some of that. The most troubling thing about our current jurisprudence with regard to our security, to me, is the state secrecy doctrine, where the federal government is allowed to prosecute people, and when the defendant tries to make this case or that case, is told, I'm sorry, that's a state secret, you can't bring it up. If that's the case, then throw the case out. I'm sorry to say that the Obama administration has also used that. That seems to me totally, the courts have been much too passive in allowing that to be invoked without making an independent judgment. But yeah, it's hard for me to think of a case, obviously, exigent circumstances, it's gonna happen right away. Again, experience, I've again talked to law enforcement officials. Very few of them have told me that there are judges who won't give them warrants, and that public safety has suffered because judges are too restrictive on warrants. It's very hard for me to think of. I can't think of any case other than, you know, the bomb's about to go off, they're about to pull the trigger, and that's allowed, in which you shouldn't have to get a warrant. Not to get a warrant to go and search what somebody's library records were. How can that be? What they're going to instantly? It's hard to think what they could immediately do with a book.
Let's go to the bombs going off in our recent experience in Boston. Apparently, these young men, or one of them, read through an internet site how to put a bomb together. I did say to my wife that if I were trying to do that, the result would have been I'd blow myself up. I no doubt about that. Do you expect? I have not heard any one person saying, "Hey, we should eliminate this. We shouldn't be allowed to publish these things."
Well, the trouble is you have no physical control of that. I mean, that's
yeah.
The publication is out of London. Look, that is. I mean, and this is something that we've had. The internet changed a little bit, but there is the point at which advocacy in general becomes incitement in particular. I think it's perfectly reasonable to ban people publishing very dangerous instructions. I don't see how the public loses anything. I mean, think about the purpose of free speech. The problem with the internet today is that it's, you know, virtually impossible to do that and still maintain a modicum of freedom. I mean, you know, even the Chinese can't totally do it with their very authoritarian system. So if you could, I could see making that prosecutable. On the other hand, it depends. People give instructions about how to use explosives to get rid of tree stumps, or I mean, it's a very hard. I don't know where you would draw the line.
Let me go to Art for a moment before we go to questions.
I noticed, by the way, that one of the great tragedies of WWII week was that explosion in Texas, and it was the substance that was used to blow up the Murrah building in Oklahoma City. Yeah. That's what caused that. I mean, that's the line between legitimate and, although obviously not, the terrible failure of government regulation in that situation.
You know, I do wonder, I'll join you on the aside, you know, how many people, at least in West Texas, were beginning to say, you know, maybe a little regulation wouldn't be a bad thing here, you know? And that's probably just a temporary crisis they'll get over. But for us here, when you look at what's on the internet, how would you go about crafting a law that you just talked about, prohibiting people from providing recipes for destructive things? Or
first, you'd say, I don't much look at the internet. I don't care where my friends had lunch. I mean, that's up to them. But it is very hard to do it. Obviously, when you become. Now, I guess the question would be this. I'm told that on that website, because there have been discussions of it, there are instructions about how to grievously harm people with a knife. That seems to me entirely bannable. The problem is a lot of these things have mixed uses. The other thing, of course, is the futility of it. And that's what, in the abstract, conceptually, I can think of things I'd like to ban, but I can't think of any enforcement mechanism that wouldn't impinge greatly on people's freedom.
Now, when you and I first worked at City Hall, and just before that time, there was actually a city censor. I believe people actually brought shows to Boston to get them banned so they could get a lot of publicity. I mean, it was, I have not seen or heard of somebody trying to ban a show or a piece of art. I mean, there was a show at the Institute of Contemporary Art maybe 20 years ago that got a great deal of attention. It was actually good for the ICA.
No, I agree with you. That's why we have made enormous strides in this country about freedom of expression in the arts as well. Yeah, I remember in 1968, the city censor in question, whom we both know and know members of his family, tried to get Old Calcutta. They tried to keep Old Calcutta from.
I might not have gone to the show if he hadn't done that.
They tried to ban Old Calcutta, and that would be inconceivable today. Including, look, we had the most recent over Robert Mapplethorpe with Jesse Helms at the Corcoran Gallery, and you had Rudy Giuliani being upset about the. In fact, it's very interesting. When Giuliani went after the Brooklyn Museum, which had some sacrilegious, it had elephant dung and some religious symbol, and at the time he succeeded, he cut them off. The man who was his agent in executing that, Joseph Lota, if that's the way you pronounce it, L-H-O-T-A, is now a Republican candidate for mayor of New York, and it's an issue he's being attacked on. He's got a, I mean, I think, again, for a variety of reasons, I think freedom of expression is as firmly rooted in America today as it has ever been in any society. Look, one of the things I'm very proud of, in much of Europe, Holocaust denial is a crime. It's outrageous that Holocaust denial should be a crime. And I regret that people push for that. There are group libel laws in Europe. I mean, we have a freer, in fact, England just moved to cut back on one of the great intrusions on the First Amendment, and that was a very, very easy to sue libel law. Under British law, if a book was published in England, if one copy was sold in England, if a book published elsewhere, you could sue for libel. So the British have just tightened up some on their libel law. So again, no, I think that's a very good example. I can't remember the last time anybody in America tried to censor legitimate speech or cultural expression outside of some very, maybe some small town school department, and even that generally gets overturned. So I think we're in pretty good shape on that.
I want to go to questions from the audience, so if we do have questions, if people want to come to the microphone here, we will get to your question.
And I'm glad, given the topic, that we are not following the pattern sometimes followed of people having to write out their questions so they can pre-screen. That would be somewhat inconsistent with the...
could you just, as you're asking a question, just give your name?
My name is Richie Timon. Congressman, you do have certain blemishes on your First Amendment credentials. You are on the wrong side of Citizens United, and I noticed that, like most of those who are opposed, you never mention the unions. That connection are also protected. So you missed the boat on that one, which suppresses free speech. McCain-Feingold's another one, and its version of the House, the Shays-Meehan, and you know the provisions I'm talking about, which also shut down free speech. Then there's your participation in perpetuating hate crimes. You want to increase the categories of hate crime instead of doing away with them. So that's 3 strikes right there. My final point is this, my question is this. Now that you're a private citizen, Congressman, will you feel more at ease to make the kind of vile, vulgar attacks like you did on the Tea Party recently, linking them with Al-Qaeda, the alleged position on gay marriage of the Tea Party, which there is none? That kind of disgusting smear, will we hear more of that from you?
Let me go in order here. I brought up the Citizens United. And no, I disagree with you that the ability to spend unlimited amounts of money in a political campaign is free speech. It certainly, many of the conservatives, like Scalia, believe in the original intent. And if you think James Madison thought that corporations should spend unlimited amounts of money, you're wrong. That has never been the rule in America. We have always had these limits. They are held elsewhere. As to unions, I'm not discriminating for or against unions. I think unions should be covered by the same laws as anybody else. Your suggestion that, yes, unions are limited I would like union spending to be limited, just as corporate spending would be limited. And if you're suggesting that, I wouldn't want to limit unions, no, I want to be totally neutral about that. As to hate crimes, the suggestion that a hate crime bill interferes with speech is, I think, totally incorrect, because here's the point. We, as I said, we don't have hate crimes in America based on hate speech. I do not believe in the concept of hate speech. I do not believe that you should be at risk for denying the Holocaust or calling anybody any names. What we do with hate crimes, and we do it with regard to categories of minorities that are likely to be victimized, nothing is a crime under a hate crime statute that was not already criminal. Hate crimes only go to the sentencing for violent acts against people or property that have already happened. So I do not believe it impinges on speech at all. And as I said to a Democratic caucus when that issue was raised, and some people said, well, some ministers were worried that if we added LGBT people to the hate crime statute, they couldn't preach against homosexuality. And I said to the caucus, look, let me be very clear. I was then chairman of the Financial Service Committee. If this bill becomes law tomorrow, it will still be entirely legal to call me a fag. I just wouldn't recommend it if you were in the banking business. So the hate crimes in no way criminalizes speech, in no way. It does take into account with sentencing. And by the way, you're saying, do you take the motive into account in sentencing? Of course you do. First-degree murder, second-degree murder. Was it a murder for pay? Was it a spur-of-the-moment murder? Was it planned? We always take those other circumstances into account. But a prerequisite for any crime here is that there was an individual wholly non-speech criminal act. And finally, what I said with the Tea Party was this, and I repeat it here. I was attacked, Jim and I were criticized by Al-Qaeda, more than criticized. Our marriage was held up as an example of the decadence of America. And in fact, I was just going over some clips, and I read a comment in one of the Washington papers from a man who was identified as a Tea Party leader who made comments about our marriage identical to those that were made by Al-Qaeda. And I said that sounded like what this Tea Party guy did. And I did say that I wondered how the right wing, and that the two most anti-same-sex marriage groups I know of are the right wing in America, not the Tea Party, the right wing in America and Al-Qaeda. And I do find it odd that on the one hand you object to what you think I'm not for enough free speech, but you want to censor mine. You want me to stop saying things that I'm going to continue to say. And the fact is, it is factual, that the attacks on my marriage that come from the right wing are very similar to those that come from Al-Qaeda. I did not compare them in any other context, but to note that they have that same position. And I will go back on campaign spending. Let me articulate on campaign spending. I think Citizens United is an attack on free speech. Because here's the deal. We have two systems in America. We have an economic system based on capitalism. And for that to work, the more money you have, the more influence you have. That's a good thing. That's the way capitalism works. But we have a separate political system, and the political system is one person, one vote. And my objection to unlimited campaign spending, anonymous or not, is that it allows the principle where money counts to overwhelm the principle of one person, one vote. I think that we should try as much as possible to preserve the equality of the vote and of people speaking, etc., on their votes. And when you allow the principle that the more money you have, the more influence you have, that's the way capitalism works. I understand that. I would like to deal with it with taxes and regulation, but that's fundamentally the principle. But I think taking the principle that the more money you have, the more influence you have, and infecting the political system with it is a very bad idea. And I do not regard it as a violation of free speech in this sense. No content is involved. Nobody is prevented from saying anything. Nobody under Shays Meehan or McCain-Feingold or under what we had before the Citizens United decision, no human being in America has ever been prevented from saying or writing or publishing or holding a sign that says anything. The only question is, do you restrict the extent to which people with much, much more money can have much, much more influence in the electoral system?
Sir.
Mr. Frank, I'd like to take you back.
What's your name?
Jack Roble.
Jack.
Mr. Frank, I'd like to take it back to your comments on the environment at Harvard on free speech when you were there. One of your predecessors as the recipient of the First Amendment Award, Harvey Silverglate, wrote a book called The Shadow University, in which he discussed the limitation of free speech at universities under the rationale that it was just disrespect for people who disagreed with him. So my question to you is, what do you think the environment is today on universities, both public and private, with respect to free speech and the ability to talk?
I don't know. I did mention, as you recall, my objection to the notion that I've seen in some colleges where you censor a speaker because he's got people who don't like him, and that you allow a mob to shout somebody down. I'm very much opposed to that. I have read from time to time, but if you ask me what's the empirical situation, I don't know. I haven't been there. But the notion that college students should be penalized for saying things disrespectful of other students, I think is dead wrong. I mean, look, you are not a believer in free speech unless at some point in your life you have defended the right of an extremely obnoxious person to say very hateful things. That's the definition of free speech. So the notion that you tell students not to insult other students. Now, yes, you can get a situation where someone can't walk in the college without 6 people yelling rude things. That becomes a kind of disturbing of the peace, intruding on their space. But it's hard for me to think that anybody ought to be punished for anything he or she wrote in a college newspaper. Not hard for me, I don't believe it. So no, I think disrespect is people. And by the way, to the extent that you think you're helping college students by sheltering them from disrespect, you ain't doing a very good job of educating them. But that's not my major reason. In principle, nobody has to respect anybody or talk respectfully about anybody.
We have more,
including. I mean, I don't think I have to talk respectfully about the Tea Party either, to be honest with you.
if you have a question and you want to line up at our microphone over here, that would be great. Yes.
Hi, my name is Ethan Long. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Suffolk Journal, the student newspaper here. And I just have a statement that I'd like to read, and I want to know what your thoughts on the statement are.
How long is it?
It's not too long.
Okay.
Statement.
I was going to censor you if it was.
Statement from Barney Frank. I am the associate of Mayor White, who made the threats to blow up the car of Boston After Dark editor Teddy Gross and the reference to reassessing Boston After Dark's building. I said this at the outset of a long phone call to a man I had considered a friend in what I had considered then and now to be an obviously humorous fashion. It is inconceivable to me that they were taken very seriously. I had been granted by the editor space to explain this fully. I failed to complete my explanation before the deadline, and so I have asked that this statement be printed to make clear that the threats of violence and reassessment so dramatically represented were clearly meant humorously and were made entirely on my initiative and resulted from a combination of my sense of humor and my deficiency as a judge of character. Barney Frank.
Yeah, I was having an argument with some guy at the Phoenix who I thought was writing stuff, and he then wrote something which was very deeply offensive, but he was somebody I knew, and he called me and said something. I said, hey, be careful when you start your car tomorrow morning. Yes, I did. That was obviously a joke. It's a joke that I have there was frankly, in the legislature, people do it all the time. Yeah, that was a joke. I don't believe anybody ever took it seriously. You really got nothing better to do than to go do it?
I like to dig around old newspapers. That just stuck out. It was so random.
What?
I like to dig around old newspapers. That was just so random and bizarre to me.
Yes. Oh, I'm sorry.
Hi.
Thank you.
Hi. This is a little off the First Amendment topic, but I've been really getting more and more concerned lately about how we seem to have accepted torture done by Americans. And I see it in so many more entertainment representations and all sorts of things. It came up with the recent attacks at the marathon, where I heard in casual conversation, oh, I wonder if they're going to torture him. And that was like, oh my God, this is the country that we live in right now. And I just wondered if you had an opinion in terms of Have we lost? Have we lost on this fight against torture in this country yet? And what do you know about, what do you see of people who are working against this to try and get torture out of the American way?
I'd make this distinction. The comments you heard from people in the heat of their anger at the bombings, I wouldn't pay much attention to them. And by the way, there's nothing new about those. I'm sure people talked about, people have been talking about, oh, I'd like to torture that bastard, etc. There was a disturbing tolerance of torture in the immediate post-2001 effort, but it's interesting to me that I'm not too discouraged in this sense. What we now have are the people who engage in what I think were torture denying that they did. And, that's not a bad thing. I mean, it's a bad thing they did it, but it's a good thing they deny it, because that's better than they're defending it. There's a great quote from La Rochefoucauld: "Hypocrisy is the tribute that vice pays to virtue." When people are being hypocritical, they know they're wrong. Look, President Obama has not done as much as I would like to see in undoing some of this stuff, although the failure to close Guantanamo was largely imposed by my former colleagues. But I do believe they have cut back on torture, and I think I think there's now an argument about. I mean, nobody's defending torture. There are people who did it, but I think we've sort of won that fight. One of the frankly practical things is that you have a large number of the people who were serious, long-time interrogators saying torture is not good. Torture doesn't give you good information. It gives you, it gives you unreliable information. You don't want to be lied to. You don't want people to tell you these things. There is a problem, I believe. Clearly there was with people being captured, and we were outsourcing torture. We were capturing people and sending them to places to be tortured. There's some disgraceful cases of that. I do think that battle is in pretty good shape right now in terms of people repudiating it. And as I said, the fact that they deny it is a good thing. And as far as Tsarnaev, he was treated very well. He was sent to a hospital. I mean, nobody tortured him. Look, for one thing, they didn't have to. I mean, this is a guy that so clearly is guilty of what had happened. But the detention, the indefinite detention of people, and it's just people tell you about the fog of war, and they will acknowledge, you pick somebody up in a war zone, you don't really have any great assurance. The fact that people are still being held who were picked up in the war zone, that's outrageous. And I was glad to see Dianne Feinstein raise that, say, look, let's rethink sending the people. There are people we agree shouldn't be locked up. We said we can't find a place to send them. There was one of the worst things. There was a proposal to resettle some Uyghurs, the people from Western China, who were Muslims and oppressed by the Chinese, and some of them showed up in Afghanistan because they were so angry, and some of them got arrested for no good reason, and we now, nobody believes they're a threat, but there was a movement to release them in Virginia, and Congressman Frank Wolf outrageously objected, and these people are still there. We're trying to find people to take them. That troubles me deeply. We should just release them.
Wow. Yes.
Well, it seems like something of a travesty to give a so-called Freedom Award to someone who's an ardent backer of the ethnocentric state of Israel, which carries out a military occupation, which practices apartheid policies according to Desmond Tutu and the Mandelas, and backs a blockade on the democratically elected government of Palestine. Doesn't ethnic types and political special interest group politics trump freedom in many political contexts?
No, when you say a blockade against a democratic elected government, which government are you talking about?
Talking about the government of Gaza, Hamas, which was elected in free and fair elections in 2006, and which was immediately put under siege by the United States and Israel for winning that election.
Well, I say not immediately. The thing is that Gaza had been totally occupied by Israel, and it relinquished control and was met by attacks by people who believe that it shouldn't exist. That happened both in southern Lebanon and in Gaza, and I was a believer in the withdrawals. But in both cases, and I argued for them, in both cases, the two places were occupied by people who proclaimed that Israel should not exist and waged armed warfare against Israel from those areas. I was struck the other day to see that there is now a blockade on people going back and forth from Gaza imposed by Hamas, and that some of the international NGOs are concerned about that. Yeah, there are aspects of this that trouble me. I'm particularly concerned about the settlements, although that's a West Bank issue. But I believe the fundamental issue is this, and you have to look at how these things started. If the Arab nations had been willing to accept the existence of a very small Israel in 1948, none of this would have happened. They tried to wipe Israel out.
That's untrue. I'd love to go back through the
yeah,
entire history.
No,
in
you
detail
guys,
with
what's
you.
untrue? What's untrue?
Are you denying the Nakba that occurred in '48? Are you
Yeah.
denying the fact that they're down to 22% of mandate Palestine, that they've already relinquished a large part which was allotted to them under the
No,
agreement
I'm not
of the
denying
UN
it.
in '47?
I'm not denying it. What I'm telling you is that it would not, if the Arabs had been willing to abide by the UN's decision, there would have been any war. Israel was then, in 1948, a much smaller segment even than it was before 1967.
They were forcibly displaced.
I'm sorry,
It was
sir.
an ethnic cleansing.
Tell me when you're through and I'll respond.
Okay.
All right. The United Nations decided to create an Israel. The Arab countries went to war with Israel to abolish it, not to change the borders, to wipe it out. They lost. Israel then maintained those borders that had been established in the war from 48 to 67. In 67, Israel, in self-defense, went to war because its Arab neighbors, most of them, had been attacking Israel, including the PLO. The PLO had been run out of Jordan and went into Lebanon because they nowhere else, they weren't strong enough to keep them out. And yes, Israel occupied territories in 67, I believe in self-defense. They then gave up the Sinai, one of the major releases, and they pulled out of southern Lebanon and and finally gave up Gaza. In both cases, they were met with great resistance. Now, I think the settlement policy in the West Bank is a mistake and bad for Israel. You still have in Gaza a government that says that Israel shouldn't exist. And no, I am not surprised, I'm not critical of a nation that says we are not going to relinquish total control to people who believe that it is their right to continue armed warfare against us.
I happened to be in Israel at the time that Gaza was turned over, and went with a couple of people to Gaza to visit families there. And and Israel was torn, and families were torn about what to do in that. And Bob Beal and I went to visit with this family.
Arab or Israeli?
Israeli, and they had been in this house for 38 years.
In Gaza.
In Gaza. The kids came back, and I was thinking about this was their house. And how hard it was and how difficult it was. And for the young kids in the Israeli army to move people out. And I left there, I think it was my third trip to Israel. My attitude was, as hard as it is for this family to begin a peace process and to make this one more turning over, this is going to make a difference. Zero difference.
Well, again, there was this distinction. You said yes after Hamas won the election. And I think that was a great tragedy because you had the Palestinian Authority in the hands of Fatah that believe in a two-state solution, although there were obviously difficulties between both sides in getting there, and Hamas who repudiates that. So I know Hamas are not just some, and in fact, what then happened, by the way, was a war, a shooting war, not involving Israel, but between the two factions of Palestinians. It was Fatah shooting at Hamas, and Hamas drove Fatah out of there. That's not Israel's fault. And I do not think Israel can be indifferent to that. And I think there is a real difference between the way things go in the West Bank, although I still think they should be more forthcoming in pulling out of settlements, and the way they are in Gaza. But I think that's the response to people who say, we're going to wipe you out, you shouldn't exist.
Yes. Could I have your name, please?
Sure. My name is Andrew Freeman. Congressman Frank, I wanted to thank you for your years of service to the state of Massachusetts. My question is, you spoke about the Citizens United case and the effect of money, unlimited money on the political sphere. I'm wondering if people have talked about a revolving door between the financial industry and the halls of government.
Who talked about that?
All sorts.
Oh, okay. I didn't,
sorry.
Okay, yeah.
For example, John Corzine went from Goldman Sachs, governor of New Jersey, to MF Global, which then collapsed. Hank Paulson went from Goldman Sachs to, I believe it was the Treasury Department. So I'm wondering if you've noticed a revolving door between financial industry, influential industries, and Washington, and whether you feel that is whether you have any opinion on that.
I think you have to be guarded about it. On the other hand, people in the financial industry can be very good regulators. When Franklin Roosevelt set up the Securities and Exchange Commission and got Congress to do that in the 30s, the securities industry, the stock market, was just rife with fraud and abuse and watered stock, etc. And Franklin Roosevelt picked a man who had been very much engaged in precisely those kind of activities to make him the head of the Securities and Exchange Commission, so he could say, look guys, I know every trick and I've used them and they're over. His name, as many of you realize, was Joseph P. Kennedy, John Kennedy's father, who I think along with the others used to vote from right around the corner there at 122 Bowdoin. There were about 37 of them registered at 122, literally.
Yeah.
But, so no, I think some financial expertise is a good thing. And there are people who came out of the financial industry. Gary Gensler is the chairman of the Commodities Futures Trading Commission, not well known as the ancient man. He came out of, I think, Goldman Sachs. He has been a very tough regulator of derivatives, helped us write a good bill about it, and has been very tough on them. It's something you have to worry about. I'll make a prediction now. Mary Jo White, who was the U.S. attorney in New York and then went to work for a law firm representing corporate clients, is now the head of the SEC, and I believe she will be very tough on the SEC. So no, I don't think there is any inherent problem. It can be overdone, and it's a good thing. Jack Lew, who's now the Secretary of the Treasury, had no such involvement. Tim Geithner, by the way, people have been critical of Tim Geithner, I think unfairly, but let me be very clear. Tim Geithner never worked for a private financial institution. He was always he'd been a public official. So it's something to watch out for. But I do not think, well, let me put it this way. There were serious problems in the latter part of the 90s, first part of this century, from people not realizing that some of the regulation had to be updated as financial practices evolved. But it was more ideological than because of the financial industry. That was the spirit of the times, as Peter said. You know, maybe some people now think regulation is not such a bad idea. I think it was more a political, cultural thing. Obviously, the financial community did it, but you have to be careful. But I do not think that has had a major negative impact. And to some extent, having people from the financial industry come into government, if they want to do the right thing, they're better prepared to do it.
Thank you.
I'm going to do two things before. Oh, yes. We'll go to your question and then close.
This is somewhat related to the last topic. Do you think that the United States government has done enough to identify and prosecute the architects of the Great Recession? And if not,
no, but there is this problem. First of all, one of the reasons there haven't been more prosecutions is that a lot of bad stuff wasn't illegal. I mean, that was part of that. That's one of the effects of not regulating. There were things that shouldn't have happened, but they weren't illegal. And by the way, I've argued with some of the people in the financial industry about that. They would say to us, well, don't write the laws too specifically. Set forward general principles. You know, leave us some discretion. But then when something bad happens, they say, oh, it didn't say there that it's illegal. So they ask for discretion and then abuse it. And I said, I want to be, I think the answer is we have to be tougher on them, but be more specific. But part of it is that it was hard to do. The other part is, and I'm frustrated, I wrote to all the financial regulators just before I left office. One argument is, well, if you penalize the institution, that's not always a good idea. I mean, what happened was, remember, the case here was when, what was the accounting firm that was criminally prosecuted and then went out of business, and now we have 3 accounting firms instead of 4, and that's not a good thing. I don't want to, the other problem is when you fine a large financial institution, the shareholders pay it. What I don't understand is why there have not been more cases of going after individuals. So there I agree with you. And they say, oh, well, they're too big to fail. I mean, I go back to what Peter said. We decided that corporations were people, but they're not the only people. I mean, every corporation that's a person has real persons there as well. And I do think there has been a failure, and it may be, oh, well, and it could be that that's where that revolving door, oh, yeah, we know so-and-so. I do think there should be more of an effort to prosecute individuals. They have been very tough on prosecuting individuals for insider trading, and that has been clearly illegal. And again, some of the stuff, by packaging a set of securities and selling it to the public, well, you bet that it's going to fail. It wasn't illegal. It's outrageous. A lot of it has been now made illegal, and they can go forward with it. On the other hand, when you talk about people misrepresenting their interest rates for the London interbank offering rate, the LIBOR, I got to think some of that was illegal, and they should go after them. So the answer is, I understand the basic problem, is, as I said, a lot of bad stuff was not illegal, and we have made a lot of bad stuff now illegal, but I do think they have been too soft on individuals. And the argument, and Attorney General said, well, we can't, you could have a negative effect if you go after the big institution. And not only that, by the way, if you're trying to get deterrence, which you are, you go after the big institution, there's virtually no deterrent effect. But you go after an individual, and it does.
I mentioned 2 things as we close. Did you have a question?
No, I was going to close.
Oh, I have 2 things I want to. I have 1 question and 1 statement. So that Barney's spouse Jim was introduced earlier. My wife Roseanne is here with me, and the love of my life. And I think it's wonderful that we live in a region, by the way, now, but that the state of Massachusetts led the way in stating that all of us as individuals get to marry whoever we love. And I think that's one of the great things.
And I am very glad that I can now say, I was worried for a while, but Jim and I can now safely assume that we have not, in our marriage, damaged anybody else's.
You know, Roseanne and I wrote an op-ed piece about that when the legislature was thinking about changing the law. We wrote it about the date that it became effective in Massachusetts, that we went to our window and looked out, and cars were still moving, people were walking on the street. The sun actually came up that day, and, and we were still married.
Briefly, they've reinstated this old commercial with the, I said to some extent, the conservative argument makes those of us in same-sex marriages the current equivalent of V8, because the theory is that some happily married man will read in the paper about Jim and me being married, and he'll say, I could have married a guy.
Thank you.
You guys want to go on, because it's getting really better and better.
Okay, then I have 1 more question for Barney. And I'll set it up this way. At one time, Barney's a state rep. The city council, 9 members elected at large, are discussing, debating whether or not the city ought to change its charter and people ought to be elected by districts and a few people and the at-large seats, which is what we know.
The current system.
And the city council so botched that it was a Saturday hearing, and it was one of those things, if you were watching it, you're just embarrassed that you live in the city. And Barney turned to testify, and Barney looked at the city councilors and said, when I came here this morning, my question was, should you be elected at large? After having watched you perform for several hours, I wonder if you should be allowed to remain at large. And in this pithy little, I mean, he did it. He, that was it. Do you have some of these lines ahead of time? Do you have lines you think of and save for the right occasion?
Generally not. They generally occur. But I will say in my defense, people think I was unfair. After I said that, at least a couple of them within a year were in fact not at large.
Yes. To our credit.
I hope a lot of your book is going to be funny. We need that. You know, we really need that. Thank you both for a really incredibly enjoyable, informative, interesting, and important evening. It's been a great honor for us to have you here.
Thank you.
And we hope to see you again.